Welcome to Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our show today, a critical view of U.S.-China policy. And joining us via Skype from Taipei, Taiwan, is today's guest, Dr. William A. Stanton. Dr. Stanton recently retired, actually 3 years ago, retired from the U.S. State Department after serving for 34 years. During his long career, he had many assignments around the world, but most significantly, 2 3-year tours in Beijing, at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, that is, and his last assignment as U.S. Director, de facto U.S. Ambassador to Taiwan. Today, he serves as Senior Vice President for Global Affairs at Tsinghua University, Taiwan, where he is also the Director of the Center for Asia Policy. Welcome to Asian Review. It's great to have you.
Good to see you again, Bill.
Great. Well, your recent paper that you wrote, U.S. Policy Towards Xi Jinping's China, really a very, very interesting paper, and I think very well documented, to give it a little academic twist there. Where has U.S.-China policy going wrong?
Well, as I try to, as I argue in my paper, I think it went wrong from the very start. I think there were an awful lot of assumptions made about China that have continued to guide U.S. policy over the years. And one after another, those assumptions, those justifications for the direction we were moving failed. The biggest failure was the very first justification for our policy, which was the geostrategic argument that we would be able to ensure there was no consolidation of a communist bloc, that in a sense, by getting closer to China, we would prevent China and the Soviet Union at the time from joining together. In fact, however, what I argue is that from the time the Shanghai Communique was signed, it actually gave China leverage with the Soviet Union, and their relationship then began to improve. And of course, what we see now is there are no two countries in the world that are arguably closer than that of Russia and China. They vote the same in the UN. China did not veto or go against. It abstained on the resolution over Crimea, the Russian referendum to get support for the takeover of Crimea. And they carry on military exercises today and generally are very supportive of one another internationally and regionally.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Are you indirectly, or perhaps more directly, sort of, how should we say, criticizing Henry Kissinger?
I think maybe I'm not too subtle about it, but yeah, I think, it's been well documented, and now we have the archival records of the negotiations in Beijing, and books have been written about this, and we know that it was President Nixon who was very interested in China. Although nowadays Kissinger is thought of as the great China hand, he knew nothing at all about China when he went there. And because of the desire to have a great public splash and a domestic political victory in the United States, they told nobody virtually about the visit to China, about the negotiations, and they refused to bring anyone who knew anything about China, including their own interpreter.
I've heard, in the last few months, I've heard more and more criticism of Henry Kissinger than I have at any time in the past. Now, I don't know, maybe, since you served 34 years in the State Department, you probably heard a few more negative things than I have, but it seems to be becoming more public knowledge the public seems to be becoming more sensitive to the fact that maybe some of his strategic thinking on China wasn't just as forward-looking as he might have liked people to believe it was. I've also heard the point raised that actually, and you sort of suggested it in your previous comments, but I heard it presented another way, but I think it brings us back to the same point, that, yeah, okay, China persuaded the U.S. that, they could be useful as a counterweight to the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union. But in actuality, they never really played that role very, very well. They were more interested in getting on some kind of negotiation that would give them leverage over the United States when it came to Taiwan.
Yeah, it's historically complicated, but I think in general, China at that point in 1972, when we did the Shanghai Communique, was very, very weak.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we talk to the Chinese, great civilization though it may be, as if they were our equals. And in fact, we got a very bad deal from them. I mean, we basically agreed to everything they wanted on Taiwan. And in turn, another point I make about our China relationship is I think the concrete benefits of cooperation have been hard to find. One of the things that Kissinger and Nixon wanted to get out of the talks was Chinese support to help end the war in Vietnam and to end the military and political support. Well, that just never happened. And it never wound up in any of the agreements. So one of the main goals that they had was not achieved. And Taiwan, which was from the Chinese point of view, the most important outcome, they basically got everything they wanted, and we got nothing on behalf of the Taiwanese. So I think part of that problem is that back then with Chiang Kai-shek in power, he was not the most popular person anymore in Washington. I think there was an underestimation of the potential for Taiwan. Nobody foresaw its democratic development, its great prosperity, partly which all came about through U.S. assistance, but an awful lot just through the hard work and correct policies of the Taiwanese themselves. So I think we were very short-sighted, both in our treatment of China, but also in our treatment of Taiwan.
It seems to me to be fair here, if we're going to criticize Henry Kissinger's strategic thinking, we probably should also criticize Brzezinski's strategic thinking, since he seemed to play along with that same thing. In fact, I've often had the sense that he was trying to catch up to Kissinger. He somehow felt left behind. Maybe Kissinger was getting more public attention than he was. Of course, Kissinger was running around with all those Hollywood starlets too, and I suppose that helped him in the PR department. I'm not sure Brzezinski ever got into that game, but it did seem that even hearing him speak in TV interviews, there was a sort of almost like jealousy of Kissinger.
Well, I don't know if he was jealous, but certainly he followed very much in the mold of Kissinger. It's partly because I think, and this has been a prevailing problem for the U.S. government through the years, is that both Kissinger and Brzezinski were essentially Europeanists who knew nothing particularly about Asia, weren't particularly interested in it, and their predominant perspective was, what do we do in this Cold War to counter the Soviet Union?
Yeah,
that was the overwhelming idea, and they didn't foresee the weakness as well in the Soviet Union, so everything they did was in terms of the Soviet Union. And I think that was a limitation, and I think that limitation has prevailed ever since. I mean, when you look at other secretaries of state, Condi Rice was interested in Russia. She was a Soviet hand. That's what she studied in graduate school. When you look at Warren Christopher, he was interested in Europe, maybe the Middle East. When you look at all of our secretaries of states, Madeleine Albright was another Russian hand, so to speak.
Right.
You've never really had anyone who paid that much attention. The exception, I would say, was when we got Hillary Clinton, and that was in part because as her assistant secretary, she had Kurt Campbell, who actually was keenly interested, given his background in the Navy, was keenly interested in Asia, keenly interested in China, keenly interested in Taiwan. So it's no surprise to me that it was during Hillary Clinton's period as Secretary of State that her essay on the pivot to Asia in Foreign Affairs in November 2011 was published. It, clearly, Kurt Campbell had a strong role to play in that. But subsequent statements and comments by Hillary Clinton, I think also were the first and most critical of China, of any Secretary of State I've seen. I mean, when she inserted into a speech that Taiwan is a strong security and economic partner, that was unheard of before. When Hillary Clinton, for example, we know went to the women's conference after much debate in Beijing in 1995. I was there at the time. There was a huge debate whether she should even go because of human rights violations in China. When she went, she didn't shake hands or meet with any Chinese officials. Since she's been running, she said more critical things about China with regard to cyber attacks, with regard to industrial espionage. So I think she's the first Secretary of State we've had who has focused as much on China as she did.
Let me ask a hypothetical question, especially since this is, we're getting into the election season here. If Hillary Clinton should be elected president, do you think she would ask Kurt Campbell to serve as Secretary of State?
It's quite possible. Either that, or I think he would certainly have a position in the National Security Council. Unlike many people in the Obama administration who are Obamaites, Kurt Campbell was clearly on the side of Clinton. That's why he got the job he did. And I think he's got a much more nuanced understanding of East Asia, and I think she would draw on his expertise again. It's something I think the Chinese are worried about. Their ideal candidate from a Beijing point of view would be Jeb Bush. Well, why? Well, because his father was president and opened up the first liaison office there. His father, for example, after the Tiananmen incident, immediately did everything he could to restore the status quo ante in the relationship between the United States and sent secret emissaries and so forth. The Bush administration was very recalcitrant in any public criticism. In fact, I think at that time, the Secretary of State, who was, remind me, from Texas, he made
James Baker?
James Baker. He made no speeches whatsoever about Tiananmen, didn't comment on it at all. Of course, he still had ambitions to be president. So, I mean, the first George Bush was very interested in China, very pro the relationship. His son, despite early criticism when he ran for office of China, followed in the line of his father. And the early criticism, for example, of Bill Clinton sacrificing confrontation for cooperation, constructive relationship, that fell by the wayside. In fact, it's true of almost all of our candidates who began, whether it was Reagan, Bush, Clinton, criticizing the Chinese, but once in office saying, no, China's too important, we have to work with them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You said something earlier, and I just kind of was reflecting on that a bit. China has had an advantage, it seems to me, since the United States first began to its rapprochement with China, prior to Nixon's trip in 1972. It's had an advantage with the American public, it seems to me. There's sort of this American emotional view of China. Maybe some of it stems from the work of the missionaries and, pre-Civil War, pre-World War II. But I can remember as an undergraduate when China was really coming on to the radar screen, just prior to Nixon's trip, there was lots of talk, public meetings, discussion about China. And there was always this very warm, effusive feeling. We never had that feeling about Russia. It was always a very hard-nosed attitude towards Russia. There was no gushy feeling when it came to Russia. But China really benefited from that. And I think there was a lot of people that felt like, maybe they had been there, their parents were missionaries or businessmen, and they still had this very warm feeling towards China. And I think China really benefited from that.
I think there's no question it did. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's partly because there'd never been a great deal of interaction with the United States, Soviet Union, or Russia earlier compared to that of China, partly because of the missionaries who thought they could convert a billion people, partly because of the education, the schools we set up there. It's a little bit more complicated. I mean, there's a book that was written, I can't offhand remember the author, but it talked about sort of the ups and downs. There were a lot of cycles in the U.S. relationship where we were in love with China, then we fell out of love, for example, after 1949, then we fell back in love with it. And I think that there's always been a feeling, there's always been a Chinese community from early on in the United States. They weren't very well treated to begin with, but I remember even as a kid going into New York, my father, who never finished high school, we went to Chinatown, and he started talking about what wonderful people the Chinese were. They're so hardworking. There's no juvenile delinquency here. The children are very obedient to their parents. So I think there was always that feeling about China that got them a pass. The problem was that, of course, we were dealing with the Communist Party of China, which was a different kettle of fish. And I think people often lost sight of the place we were actually dealing with. I think that's a little bit less true of those officers who got to serve long periods of time, as I did, a total of 6 years in Beijing. And we're up against the hard nose of the Chinese as it currently exists. And I think, particularly under Xi Jinping, that hard edge has gotten even harder. And so, as I point out in my essay, in 2014, there was a group of 70 some odd journalists who got together about China, and has the American media misguided the American public? And their conclusion was, yes, we have. A lot of our assumptions about China were wrong. And I have to admit that during my first tour, when I was in Beijing, up until the Tiananmen incident, when I was also there, the Tiananmen massacre, part of my job with the visitors, delegations, Winston Lord was our ambassador, was to tell people what in fact seemed to be true, that China was improving. There was certainly more personal freedom. You could occasionally see people holding hands, a man and a woman, when they walked down the street. When I went back in 95 and 98, that was even more true. Business was beginning to take off. Hong Kong and Taiwanese businessmen were putting up new housing. So foreigners in the future, not me, would no longer have to live in walled-in compounds for foreigners. And there was a sense that China was opening up. But with the arrival of Xi Jinping, it's gone in the opposite direction. And if anything, the combination of his regional belligerence and aggression on the South China Sea, the East China Sea, his crackdown domestically, whether on Tibetans, Uyghurs, journalists, bloggers, human rights activists, lawyers. There's, I think, for a lot of people, it's been a wake-up call, and it's had a lot to do with, I think, we're beginning to see the end of maybe the Kissingerian golden era in which China was always enveloped in a halo. People are asking much tougher questions. You get the AmCham Beijing doing a survey, and the majority of American businessmen are increasingly skeptical about China and its practices. So I think finally the bloom is off the rose. And I think, as other people have talked about this, we may be reaching an inflection point. And people who belong to the old Kissingerian school are writing essays that reflect that fear. I mean, Jeff Bader wrote an essay for Brookings called "Let's Not Make the Chinese into Enemies."
Bill, let me just jump in here. My broadcast engineer is telling me I have to take a break here. And
Yeah.
we want to come back and talk about this. And also, since you mentioned Jeff Bader, we want to talk about some of this big personnel shift that's taken place in Washington amongst China, government China experts. The disappearance of Evan Medeiros, for example. What does all that mean? And we'll come right back.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, my name's Hillary Weinberg. I'm the host of The Whole Gamut on Think Tech Hawaii. See us live every Tuesday at 1 p.m. or on our YouTube channel to hear us talk about world affairs from Hawaii and beyond. See you then.
Aloha, my name is Josh Green. I'm a senator from the Big Island. I work in the ER there. But on Tuesday afternoons, I get to come and spend 45 minutes to an hour with Jay Fidel and the Think Tech staff. They're terrific professionals. They help us to bring some of the leading cutting-edge topics here across our state to you. So you can join us at our show on healthcare in Hawaii to talk with leaders from across all the spectrum of health in our state, or you can join us for any other show where we talk about economic development or tourism or some really eclectic programs too. So really, we'd love to see you here on our show. Thanks for joining us and thanks for supporting us.
Well, we're going to come back now.
Okay.
Welcome back to Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. William A. Stanton, joining us via Skype from Taipei, Taiwan. Dr. Stanton, before retiring from the U.S. State Department after 34 years of service, served as the U.S. Director, de facto U.S. Ambassador to Taiwan. We've been having a very, very interesting and very informative discussion about U.S.-China policy. Well, what about some of these personnel changes in Washington? Evan Medeiros is gone. There have been some other significant changes, I would say, in the U.S. Department of Defense. It seems that the U.S. is turning a corner on China policy, that it's perhaps its patience is worn thin. What's your take?
Well, there have been some personnel changes, but, and very much in Washington, personnel is policy. But I frankly think that after all these years, it's getting harder and harder to justify business as usual with the Chinese. And to some extent, I think, although a lot of our policy lines coming out of the Obama administration have remained the same, I think there is a changing attitude. I think there's a recognition, for one thing. I mean, another point I make in my essay is that concrete positive outcomes of our relationship with China are few and far between. We praise China for joining in the Iran nuclear agreement, an agreement I support. But on the other hand, there's considerable evidence from many scholars, including from the State Department, that China has been a main source of material and technology for the Iranian nuclear program. We praise the six-party talks, and indeed China is trying to get them started again. But in my view, having myself been somebody who had to write press guidance praising the six-party talks, they achieved nothing whatsoever. A
failure. What did they achieve? And this nuclear thing, too, if I think about Pakistan, where did it get its nuclear technology? North Korea, I mean, just a couple years ago, the Chinese were still supplying missile parts to North Korea. I agreed with your list of, how should we say, complaints or points of evidence why the U.S.-China policy has not really worked. You talked about cyber warfare. I included with that espionage, which there's a lot of Chinese espionage in this country. And making it harder for U.S. firms to do business in China. Currency manipulation. China says, it strongly supports non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, but where were they on the Ukraine? And another thing that I find a lot of people don't know about, but is these reverse mergers that China was engineering into the New York stock market, which are really very, very shady. And actually, I think Wall Street's a little complicit there too, because they kind of, I think, turned their eyes and said, well, if China does this, so what? We want more Chinese money in the New York stock market. But the whole idea of reverse mergers and the Chinese play on the New York stock market, I think is a point of concern.
Well, I think all those concerns you mentioned, and there are many others that I think, companies originally went into China very starry-eyed. And, one of the clear results, of course, of going into China was it's led to massive increases in the loss of jobs here in the United States. And the argument that I've heard from some companies, well, the jobs would have gone elsewhere anyway, because there's cheaper labor. But I would have said to that, well, better they go to Mexico or go to Vietnam than go to China, because China is not supportive of most of our foreign policy goals, has not been particularly friendly to us. And so I think there's a mindset change going on. I think people are aware of it. It remains to be seen how effective it'll be. We have to wait for the next election and what the outcome of that is. But I think since going back to 1972, we're now 43 years or so after the 72 communique. We've tested for 4 decades our relationship with China, and I think it's been found wanting in so many respects. And many people will say, well, we have to have a relationship with China. That's true. But I think our relationship, our attitude should be much more hard-nosed about what do we specifically get out of our dealings with China. And that should be the only criteria. It shouldn't be based, as it always was under Kissinger and even Brzezinski, that for geostrategic reasons, the relationship was important in itself, no matter what they did, no matter what they said. I think we need a much more realistic policy in dealing with China. The same kind of relationship we have now, for example, with Russia. We don't take anything for granted, and we have no great expectations that a positive gesture is going to yield results.
Interesting. Well, I guess you just answered this question, but let me ask it anyway. It's been so much talk in the last few years about Chinese salami slicing. And I would assume from your previous answer that the way to deal with that is to become tougher with China, become harder, not be so forgiving or making excuses or looking the other way, is really get tough.
Well, for example, I know the U.S. military, Pacific Command, the Navy, for many years has supported the idea of more freedom of navigation exercises, both in the Taiwan Strait and elsewhere, the South China Sea. And I think pretty consistently, the White House, the NSC, didn't want to do that, feeling it would upset things. And I think there are still naysayers within the U.S. government. And of course, there are naysayers in many other countries, particularly I would note in Australia. But I think it's very important that the United States do these freedom of navigation exercises to make a point and to continue to do them. I think that when we sit down to negotiate, we have to always ask, what's in it for the United States? How is it going to affect U.S. jobs? What are we going to get out of it? And I think we also need to recognize, and this is something that I think also accounts perhaps for the mood change as much as personnel changes, as much as maybe 40 years of evidence that the relationship hasn't really gotten us anywhere. And that is, that China's not doing so well these days.
Good
Economically,
point.
it's been, had the stock market shock. It's lowered its interest rates at least 6 times to try to compensate for that without results. It's now, it's manipulated its currency again to make things cheaper. It's quite clear, though, that China is not growing at 7%. It might not even be at 6.9%. Some people say, I just read something in Bloomberg that it's probably 2 or 3% GDP growth below what they're claiming. On top of that, you have a lot of evidence. When I was in Australia, somebody told me that the best way to predict the outcome of the Australia elections was to look at what the betting was on the outcome. And the reason was that people may say something if you ask them on the phone in a poll, but people will always vote the way they bet their money. And so if the money is going towards a candidate, you can be sure that candidate will win. And historically, it's always been true, apparently, at least up until the time I left Australia. Now you see
Bill, we're going to have to take another break here. Sorry to butt in. Okay, we'll come back and pick this up. And let's talk a little bit about those Australian naysayers when we come back. And then we'll move on to a more focused discussion on Taiwan itself. And you're watching Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. William A. Stanton, joining us from Taipei, Taiwan. Dr. Stanton served as de facto U.S. ambassador to Taiwan before retiring from the U.S. State Department approximately 3 years ago. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Aloha, my name is Roy Kodani, and every Wednesday at 1 p.m., I host Life in the Law, which is a segment of Think Tech Hawaii. And basically, I host guests who have some relevancy to law in Hawaii. And I hope you will continue to tune in. If you have questions, tweet us at Think Tech Hawaii. Mahalo.
Aloha, I'm Carlos Juarez, host of Global Connections, and I want to invite you to come join us. We cover a range of global issues. We bring a lot of expert opinion, a lot of issues, whether they're contemporary events happening in the world or maybe looking at things from a more historical perspective. Global issues, very important for us to understand in this globally interconnected world. Join us here on Global Connections.
Welcome back to Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. Bill Stanton, joining us from Taipei, Taiwan. He's a highly experienced, but now retired U.S. diplomat. And we've been talking about U.S.-China policy and where Dr. Stanton thinks it has gone wrong. Just before the break, we had mentioned something about Australian naysayers, and I suspect that you mean Kevin Rudd, and the former Australian Prime Minister also served as Foreign Minister, and self-proclaimed China expert. And also Hugh White, who served in the Australian Ministry of Defence and also, as I recall, is currently a professor of strategy at Australian National University. Well, you served in Australia, so I guess you had an opportunity to observe these folks up close, or at least fairly up close. What's your take on them?
Well, I'm a little bit surprised about Kevin Rudd. When I knew him when he was seeking the leadership of the Labour Party, he is actually an extremely fluent Mandarin speaker. He's very knowledgeable about China. And at that time, he always took a very tough attitude in his remarks to me about the Chinese. And in fact, for the most part, when he came to office, I think the Chinese were shocked because they expected him to be a so-called, quote, friend of China. And in some ways he was, in other ways he was very tough-minded in dealing with him. But it's notable that now that he's left government, stepped down or lost the election for prime minister, he has taken a very pro-China stand, even to arguing at Harvard that China, I think incorrectly, will continue to grow economically, that it's going to be a great power, and therefore, in a very sort of wry manner towards the United States, says, deal with it, America. And the way he proposes that the United States deal with it is basically you're going to have to make way for China's dominance in East Asia. I'm giving a shorthand, a little bit exaggerated version, but it's very much the version that Yu White, who wrote The China Choice. Here's somebody who never lived in China for any length of time, has visited it. Last year was the first time he ever visited Taiwan. Yet he's written essays about how the world needs to give up Taiwan to China because it's not worth the nuisance. Well,
Is this Hugh White you're talking about now?
yeah, this is Yu White.
Okay, so we shifted from Kevin Rudd.
Yeah, I
Okay.
shifted. And
Because
I'm
I
saying,
recall Kevin Rudd had studied Chinese in Taiwan some years ago.
no, he knows Taiwan and China well, and he has great Chinese. Yu White, who's a professor at Australian National University, only visited Taiwan last year once in his life. He's written essays about how the United States and other countries should abandon Taiwan. And he's written a book called The China Choice, saying basically the United States needs to cede strategic dominance to China in East Asia. One of the facts he overlooks is that the reason we're in East Asia is because other countries want us to be there. Only China does not. And there are other Australian views, of course. Recently, Bruce Jacobs, he's a professor emeritus at Monash University, wrote an excellent piece pointing out that the only real threat to peace in South China Sea and elsewhere is China. So there are opposing views, but I would say I've been particularly surprised by Kevin Rudd adopting a very pro-Chinese attitude since he left government.
Hugh White's view is very similar to Chaz Freeman's view, isn't it?
Yes, and to other people, this fellow who writes at George Washington University, who knows nothing about China or Taiwan particularly, but argues for geostrategic reasons in the abstract, the U.S. needs to say goodbye to Taiwan. Now, the point I always make is Taiwan is a democracy of 23 million people. It's about the size of Australia. Would the United States ever say bye-bye Australia? And how would the Australians like it?
Right. Well, let's, on our last, let me see, what do we have here? Well, our last 17 minutes or so here. Oh, I've been corrected, that's 5 minutes. I never was very good at math. Let's focus on Taiwan. As you said, I think consistently, directly and indirectly throughout our conversation here, Taiwan has consistently been sold short. It's been thrown under the bus, supposedly for the benefit of U.S.-China policy. But indeed, it was at one time a brutal dictatorship. It now is a very vibrant democracy. It was an underdeveloped agrarian society, and now it's a very wealthy country that's plays a key role in the global technological hub. But still, we haven't given Taiwan any kind of real role in the pivot. It's excluded from RIMPAC. It could play a more significant security role. I believe Taiwan military officers would like to play a more significant role. I think part of what I would perceive as the morale problem in the Taiwan military is they don't think they have a role in much of anything. China is really good at playing business interests, be it in the United States or in Taiwan, and which I think in the long term has been to the detriment of the United States. What kind of security role is possible for Taiwan to play?
Well, under current guidelines, there's not much, but what many people don't realize is that it's a much more vibrant relationship unseen. For example, while it is known that Taiwan's F-16 pilots still train in the United States, that there are huge numbers of U.S. military officials, civilian defense officials, and defense contractors that visit Taiwan all the time. There is cooperation, but it's not that extensive. And part of the problem, as in more recent years become, you mentioned espionage before, there's a lot of espionage in Taiwan.
Yeah, that's true. That distresses me quite a bit, actually. Yeah.
And there's also a very strong fifth column here of people who are working on behalf of the Chinese government. So that's a problem. But it's also true that I think President Ma has not been all that interested in defense spending. He's not been all that interested in building the military. He's always argued that the best defense, he may be right, is to have a good relationship with China, non-threatening relationship. But even Switzerland, as I always point out, they have a strong military. Everybody there is drafted. Everybody has a gun in their home. You know, if you're a nation and you want to protect your sovereignty, if only your naval, your territorial naval maritime territory, your air territory, you need a military to do that. And I think in some ways, the current administration here in Taiwan has tried to make military into more of a civil defense force for the case of typhoons.
I have that impression too. I agree with you. I don't think that President Ma is very much of a military man at all. And although he made all those speeches for F-16 Cs and Ds, none of them seem to be very credible to me.
And fewer were made as time went on. There were more in his first administration. I think when he meets with American visitors, he downplays military sales. There's also a problem that they haven't put enough money in the budget to buy anything much. So, and that's another point I always make, that people always say, well, it's arms sales that get in the way of the U.S.-China relationship. We haven't sold anything significant to Taiwan in over 4 years now, and it hasn't made an iota of difference.
We have about 2 minutes to go here. You know, it does seem the DPP, at least based on what they're saying, is that if they get back in the government, and it seems they will, at least the president's office, that they want to ramp up their defense expenditures to 3% of GDP. Lots of people in Washington have been advocating for that for some time, but will they really do that? That's, you know, a question that's in the back of my mind. I know what they say, but will they really do it?
Well, I think they may want to do it, but it's not going to be easy to do. If you recall, during Chen Shui-bian, when there was even on the table an offer from George W. Bush to sell submarines, it was blocked in the legislature, which was controlled by the KMT.
Right, I do recall that.
So one thing it would depend on which way the legislature goes. It'll depend on overall, are there going to be tax reforms to collect more money from the people who have profited so much from this government? You know, there's clearly a discrepancy in tax payments on the part of many. So I think their heart is in the right place. Whether they can do it remains an open question. I think there's also a belief that perhaps they could do more in the way of indigenous defense development. But that may only go so far unless they get U.S. technology assistance.
Okay, well, we're coming down here to about our last 20 seconds, so let me ask for a prediction. Seems a good way to end a show. Who will be the president after 2016, January 2016? Who will control the legislature?
Well, I think it'll probably be Tsai Ing-wen will win the presidency unless something very untoward happens between now and then. The legislature is going to be much closer, and I would say up until this recent split in the KMT, it would probably be the KMT. Now I think it's kind of up in the air. A final point I would want to make, though, is before I was talking about where you put your money. You know, there are a lot of surveys showing that China, where are the wealthy in China putting their money? They're putting it in the United States and in Western democracies. They're putting it overseas.
We're going to have to finish it there. Okay. Thanks a lot for joining us. It was great talking to you. You gave myself and the audience a lot to think about, and I really appreciate you joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, great. And thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next week at our regular time on Monday afternoons from 4 to 4:45. Thank you again for watching.